Revolution, and maybe up till the end of the reign of Stalin. I am not sure when time will be over and what events it will be possible for me to explain and what not. But the main idea of this lecture, of course, it's not a lecture on the history in precise sense of the term. It's a lecture of some idea of history of the history of, for example, Russia, communist Russia now. What is it, communist Russia? What it was? Maybe, if it will be possible for me, for you, for the university, in the spring semester, maybe I will deliver lectures on the standard history of Russia, but of the 20th century, but not now. So it is necessary for me to speak with you, and it's interesting for me. I never delivered lectures in this approach, philosophy of modern Russian history. It's the first attempt, and you are first victims of this attempt. I'm sorry. But the theme of this lecture, of course, is very dramatic, and on the other hand, very, very deep and serious, because if we are wrong in the understanding of the sense of communist state, we will be wrong even in the evaluations of today's Russia. You are welcome. Communist revolution, communist, not revolution, of course, though it is named revolution, but it named Russian Revolution. You know that Richard Pipes named the large period of Russian history in the beginning of the 20th century just from the first years of the 20th century up till the 1926 approximately. And I will explain why this date he took. As a Russian Revolution, as a period of Russian Revolution. 6 3-volume work, Russian Revolution, I think that is the best study for the theme, not only in English, but in all languages, even in Russian. Russian Revolution. And he was a great specialist in this theme, I ought to say. But the October coup d'etat took place in 1917, in October, and there is a lot of mythology around this event. Many people, even now, suppose, and also not only simple people, but specialists, suppose that it was the great new stage of the development of Russia and maybe of the whole world. In some sense, it was really a great event, but not in the sense the majority of these people supposed. This revolution and the future organizing of communist Bolshevik state was some recommendation, some strong recommendation of history to all European politics, that it is necessary to build socially equal state. Without socially equal state, revolutions like Russian one maybe occurred in other countries. That's why after the Russian Revolution we see all over the Europe and even in the North America the new approach laborist parties, simple people, enlarging of electorate base take place everywhere. So Russia, maybe some of you who knows Russian philosophy a little bit, know that in the 19th century there was Russian philosopher Pyotr Yakovlevich Adaev, one of the greatest Russian thinkers, who was, it's specific for Russian absolute state, who was proclaimed a madman officially, though he was absolutely normal and even very clever person. But he wrote in one of his articles that Russia ought to give some lesson. Maybe Russia is existed only to give some lesson to the whole world. And in some sense, he was right. Russia gave this lesson to the world in Russian Revolution. But it was not a positive lesson, a lesson of something wonderful future. It was a negative lesson. It is necessary to abstain from some deeds, from some politics, not to repeat, not to follow a Russian example. So the first lesson of Russian evolution was a negative lesson. If ruling groups does not support the simple strata of society, lower strata of society, some people, immoral people, may use these large masses of population for seizing a power, as it took place in Russia. Another lesson was more positive. A lot of Russian people, after the revolution, left Russia not to live in the Bolshevik state. And these people were, in their majority, educated people who understood very well what is it Russian communist regime, and they gave really many positive things to the world. So the significance of Russian revolution is in one negative lesson and in one positive lesson for the world, but not for Russia. For Russia, the lesson of revolution is totally negative, but this negative lesson is not understood, is not caught by Russian people, and maybe not only Russian people, up till now. So our lecture is an effort to find a real sense, real meaning of Bolsheviks, of communist regime in Russia. As you remember, in the Holy Gospel, you have the words of Jesus Christ on their deeds would show you their mind. So look on the deeds of the people and you can understand what they think. And for the first moments of Russian Revolution, we see one and very thoroughly realized attempt of Bolsheviks who seized power in November 1917. To preserve this power, to increase it, and to eliminate any possibility to liquidate their power over Russia. The main idea was not only to have power in Russia and for Russia, it was power over Russia for building a worldwide state, worldwide communist state. Russia is not the goal. Russia is not the goal of communists, Russian Bolsheviks, but only a Platzdal, only a jumping off place, if to speak in English, a jumping off place for world revolution. So Russia was not for Lenin, Trotsky and their company some goal to make life of Russian people better, nothing like this. Russia is only a mean for future revolution all over the world. And the goal of this worldwide communist state was not also the good life, the prosperity, the freedom of simple people. Nothing like this. And nobody ought to follow this communist agitation and to believe in it. The goal of Bolsheviks was very simple. Power, power, and again power. Power over the whole world, over the maximum population and territory they would be able to catch. It is necessary to understand this simple thing. Yes, Bolsheviks say a lot of things about wonderful future of the peoples of the world. But in practice, in their deeds, they did nothing for the better life of the people. But a lot of things to organize state as a military vehicle to conquer another nations and another states. So in the 20th century, if we speak about communism, not only communists, it's Nazi regime also, never believe to words, only look on deeds. It's very important principle. And I ought to say that if we speak about Nazi for a moment, about Hitler and his theory, it was more honest than communist one. Hitler said frankly, we are supreme race, other races are lower than our, we ought to rule world, Germans, real Aryan people ought to rule world, and other people ought to be slaves, ought to be serfs of German nation. Jews are enemies, etc. Democracy is fails thing. The leader, Führer, is higher than all laws. It was Nazi principles. They speak openly these terrible ideas, but open. They didn't camouflate them into some liberal words. Nothing like this in Russian communist Bolsheviks propaganda. Bolsheviks from Lenin up till the end of Bolshevism, even up till Mr. Putin now, they speak about democracy, about real democracy, about prosperity of all nations, of all people, but in future. And now it's necessary to have dictatorship of proletariat. What is it, proletariat? Nobody knows. From the theory, from the ancient Roman history, we know that proletariat is the lowest level of population of ancient Rome. But of course, Lenin means something else. He speaks not about poor people. It was not the rule of poor people. Dictatorship of proletariats was a dictatorship of party leaders, of leaders of revolution. So it was also a lie. We have a lot of lies, a lot of words without real sense. It is some mark of communist ideology. A communist speaks one things and did absolutely different things. Up till the 1917 up till now. So, in the beginning, they did some things which later will be named as mistakes. Two rapid steps these deeds were named in future by communists. But in practice, it were very absolutely necessary deeds for establishing an absolute totalitarian system in Russia. It was not a mistake. It was well realized and well reflected activity. First moment is confiscation of all property. If somebody has private property and can use it freely and take money, take results of using this property, he is an independent person. He is an independent person who can live independently from the state, and state depend on him because he pay taxes, but not he depend on state. State is an instrument in his hands. But for totalitarian state, it's impossible. It's impossible to think about Russia as a vehicle for worldwide revolution if people of Russia will be free people who may follow communists and may not. It was necessary to do that all people ought to follow communists because they had no any sources for life. State gives the only source for their life. And state has the absolute power over his life and death. That's why a revolution, communist coup d'etat, starts from the confiscation of all the property. And not once, but in 2 years, from 1918 up till 1920, even 1922, there were a lot of the communist decrees which proclaimed all property of Russian people, money, land, possessions in towns and cities, homes and buildings, some other forms of property. All this property proclaimed to belong to the state. But what was communist state? Communist state was nothing less and nothing more than a couple of leaders. So all the property in the state belonged to a group of people who are usurpers of power, who took all power in their hands. And they gave this property to whom they like. And since many people, maybe a lot of people, were in need for some property, to live. Peasants want to have land, merchants want to have houses to live. They ask this property to be given to them. Not only their own property, which was confiscated, but also the property of other persons. For example, the lands of landlords, of rich merchants, were taken by peasants, into the hands of peasants, not as property, but only as a temporary possession. But people who took property of other persons understood very well that they made crime according to the Russian law and to the worldwide law in general. That's why they start to support communists. And communists took great support among people because they not only confiscate property, but because they returned this property to the people as a temporary possession. It was the first step of communists to take a support from the population. Another step was rejecting all trade. All trade was prohibited in 1918, and only distribution of all products, by the state of course, was allowed. So nobody can sell and nobody can buy anything. It's very easy to understand that hunger, starvation, yes, famine occurred in Russia, all over Russia, and there was special platoons in revolutionary language. They were named prodotrяды, so platoons for confiscation of products of labor. And these platoons took everything from the peasants. Peasants, of course, for living, they had land, they grow grain, they have some cows and cattle and hens, and these platoons confiscated everything, allowed only very small part of this production continue to be in the hands of the peasants, and all this confiscated food and other things were taken to the center and were given to people who agreed to follow them, who agreed to serve them, who agreed to go to the communist some administration, who agreed to go to the communist repression system. First of all, NKVD, and before NKVD it was ЧК, Special Commission. and many people to obtain some food, some wood, because it was necessary to heat their flats, their houses. They go to communists and agreed to every job they gave with only idea to receive some bread, some food for their families. And so these people who took products which were confiscated from another people also turned to be part of communist system, also made crimes according to the Russian law, and that's why they start to support communists, though they saw that their friends, relatives, and neighbors are starving without food, began to some epidemics, some illness among people turned to be very strong. And I ought to say that about 9 million people in Russia during the Civil War died, not because of military actions, but because of starvation and epidemics following by famine. So people try to survive, and that's why they go to Bolsheviks. You may ask me a question, and how Bolsheviks could organize this system of repression? How Bolsheviks, who had no any traditional power, could be successful in this organization of system of repression, which allows them to confiscate property and life possessions? The answer is very simple. They organized special groups, which is named Red Army, and special platoons of people, mostly from Latvia, from Estonia, who cannot speak good Russian, but they paid them in gold, because they took many gold from former Russia. They paid them in gold. And they gave them the possibility to confiscate property what they like. So it was a group of people, soldiers and officers of Red Army, who supported them because of absolutely money interest, not ideological interest. Many of these people, after the Civil War was over, returned to Latvia, to Estonia, bought estates, and live as rich peasants in their estates, but bought for money which they were taken from Bolsheviks. And many people wanted to make career among Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks in the years of Civil War organized a system in which some people, the majority of people, had nothing, almost nothing, were absolutely poor, but minority had not everything, of course, but many things, and communist leaders had everything. So this system, very primitive system, worked in Russia, and people who were against it went to the White Army and struggled against it, and slogans of White Army were not slogans of some succession of pre-communist Russia. They want to build new Russia, really democratic, liberal Russia, but and even socialist Russia. The first anti-communist governments were socialist governments, but not communist. But majority of people didn't support them. The real tragedy of Russia, of these years of civil war, was in the fact that though because of some historical circumstances, white army, anti-communist army, and because of the help of course, of Czech legionnaires also, but it was only one aspect. The main aspect is the crash, the collapse of German and Austrian Empire, because Germany and Austria supported Bolsheviks. But collapse of the empires in the November 1918 produced an effect that German and Austrian troops and Turkish troops left Russia, and Bolsheviks lost their support. That's why white Russians, who supported Entente Cordiale, Great Britain and France, they start their offensive way to Moscow, and they liberated maybe 2/3 of the territory of Russian Empire up to the autumn of 1919. But the majority of people, even on the liberated territory where was anti-communist administration, refused to go to army, refused to support white forces. For the majority of population, the Reds, communists, were ours, and whites were enemies, because communist propaganda and deeds organized population as collaborators who worked with communist state. They took possessions, they took land from communists, and they didn't want anti-communists to win the war. They were afraid. If anti-communist forces win the war, the property which communists gave them to use were taken away, and maybe even some penalties for them would take place. That's why, after the 5 years of struggle, just in October-November 1922, so 100 years ago, in these days we celebrate 100 years of the end of the Civil War, white armies left Russia, from European Russia in 1920, from Far East in 1922, and Russia found itself in the hands of communists. Under the pressure of terrible dictatorship. I said about two moments, confiscation of property and confiscation of all products of human labor by communists. There was third very serious moment in the communist practice. It was lead terror. So terrible massacre of people, not because they were enemies of the regime, but with the only goal to kill some, for everybody would be afraid of new rulers. Red Terror produced terrible effect, and more than 2 million people. And you ought to understand that the population of Russia, of the part of Russia which was in the hands of communists, because some parts of Russia were not in the hands of communists, of that Russia, for example, Finland, Poland, Lithuania, but under the hands of communists were approximately 145,000 millions of people. And 2 millions, more than 2 millions, 2 millions and 300,000 of people were killed by Red Terror. It's terrible things. And they were not only killed, there was a terrible, terrible attitude to these people. They died in after very terrible tortures, the majority of them. When civil war finished and communists saw that they were successful in their propaganda, they saw that Russia, which was under their rule, was totally ruined. And it was impossible to continue to do something in the state where so many people died, where all property was in the hands of communists, and nobody wanted to continue to work because the products of their work would be confiscated. That's why in 1921 communists decided, after the victory in the European Russia, and when they organized the first terrible famine, it's another question, I'll tell about it 2 minutes later, they decided to organize new economic policy. In Russian it's NEP, новая экономическая политика, new economic policy. So they decided to return to normal market relations in economics. After terrible 5 years of this building of communist dictatorship, they returned to market economy because it was impossible to continue to rule country by their means. And it was not wise at that time because they were successful in establishing their power in Russia. Another moment was that Bolsheviks wanted to continue their revolution over the borders of Russia. They never think of themselves as Russian revolutionaries, Russian nationalist revolutionaries who want to build anything in Russia. They think about themselves as worldwide revolutionaries, and they immediately, in 1919, started to struggle in different countries. You know the revolution in Hungary, of course, communist revolution in Hungary. You know the attempt of revolution in Bayern and in some parts of Germany, even in Berlin. This revolution of 1919. Maybe not all of us know that there were attempts to capture Iran, and it was established in 1920, Giuliani Republic, in the southern part of Caspian Sea, in today's Iran. They, of course, at that time, independent states of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and at last in 1921, Georgia. In 1920, they start their assault to Poland, and not only to Poland, because the order of Trotsky through Tukhachevsky was go through Warsaw to Berlin. So it was their intention to organize worldwide communist empire. And in Finland, of course, they also supported in 1918, supported Red Revolution by Russian forces, organized by Russian forces. So Bolsheviks tried to organize worldwide revolution, but in vain. You know, this miracle on Wisla in August 1920. After this miracle on Wisla, Bolshevik as army returned to Russia. A lot of people were lost. But this unsuccessful war didn't produce a change of regime, because the majority of people of Russia at that time had some illusions about communists. Maybe during this new economic policy, illusions start to disappear step by step, because people again receive some property, money again turned to be valid. There were issued new money, gold ruble was issued at that time, and one new ruble was changed to 50 billions of previous rubles of revolution. These previous rubles were named Leninki, because the portrait of Lenin was on this paper. And new gold ruble was changed to 50 billion, one ruble to 50 billion rubles. You see, so the price of Lenin was not so high at that time. And in some way, economics began to restore. And to the end of this new economic policy, to the 1927, the level of industry and agriculture in Russia almost was increased to pre-war level of 1913. So it was a successful attempt. Very quickly, with market, Russian people override their tragedy of revolution and began to organize normal life. But it was normal for simple people, but not for communists. Because communists understood very well that if again new social groups appear which are independent from them, which have their own sources for income, absolute power, absolute totalitarian power will be absolute totalitarian power, they will lost their power. Because these economically independent peasants and workers, they will ask for political rights. And since in ideology, Bolsheviks say that their state was a state of peasants and workers, so these peasants and workers would say them, okay, give this power to us. And that's why in 1927, and Bolsheviks always said that this new economic politics was only a tactical maneuver. It's not forever. It's not a change of political strategy. It's only tactics. Tactics to preserve power. Because, I repeat it, the main task of Bolsheviks was the power, not the prosperity of people, not the good life for simple people, only power, power by itself. And that's why Stalin, in the end of 1927, in September, then in December, into meetings of communist leaders of Russia, declared that we ought to change our politics toward peasantry. We ought to liquidate independent peasant ownership and to organize collectivization. So, organization of peasants to special, practically state farms. Formerly, they were not state but collective farms, but practically it was state farms. And this new way to collectivization started in 1928, in the second half of the 1928. In 6 years, with the great difficulties, because of many revolts among peasants, because peasants didn't want to be collectivized. They took everything from new state, communist state, when this new state gave them land. And now they want only one thing, that the state allows them to live as they like. But communist state didn't want to give them this possibility. And that's why peasants were against collectivization. They wanted to continue to be independent owners of land and the result of their production, the products of their labor. And since the new financial system allows them to sell the products of their labor and to receive money and pay taxes in money. It was it was the main idea of new economic policy. And they want to continue this form of life and even to increase and force it. But communists understood very well that this way is the way out of communist dictatorship. All of them, Stalin, Bukharin, Rykov, Trotsky, all of them understood that it is impossible to give peasants their land and the right to possess the results of their labor forever. Only for some years for tactical reasons to improve economic situation in Russia. And when communist leaders understood that they may lose their power, they start collectivization. This collectivization maybe was one of the most terrible things in Russia in the 20th century. It is possible to name it Holocaust. Of course, when we speak about Russia, we speak about Soviet Union, where not only Russia, but Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asian, Transcaucasian states existed. And this collectivization and famine organized by the state. And I wanted to tell you that we have 3 handmade terrible famines in the communist period of Russian history. The first one was organized by communists in 1921, 1922. It's famine in Volga region, Gold в Поволжье. But it's not only Volga region, it was all over the most prosperous parts of Russia. The second one is 1932, 1933. And the third one after the Second World War in 1946, 1947. All 3 famines were terrible, with cannibal accidents all over the country. It was a really terrible thing. It's impossible even to express the level of cruelty of Bolsheviks who organized this, but they organized. They had all possibilities to decrease the level of, and even to not to produce this famine at all, but they confiscated all grain, all harvest after in autumn, in November. And of course, since all harvest was confiscated from the hands of peasants, in December, in the winter, this famine started, and about 6 or even more million people were died by terrible, cruel death. The only goal of this famine was to protect power, nothing else. Bolsheviks was not so stupid person who can't understand that if you confiscate all grain from the hands of peasant, the peasant will die from hunger. It's not very difficult to understand this simple idea. And Bolsheviks did it, and there were a lot of documents, a lot of rules, a lot of prescriptions were made at that time. So we know now, though not all archives in Russia are open, but archives in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan are opened. And we know very well that it was a well-organized system of massacre of population. It was real genocide, not of peasants, but of Russian people. Not of Russian in ethnical sense, but of the citizens of communist state of Russia, which communists named Soviet Union. And after this organized famine, collectivization turned to be successful. In 1942, during the Second World War, when Prime Minister of Great Britain, Mr. Churchill, came to Stalin for the first time in the August 1942 and spoke with him once, he asked him about collectivization, because Churchill was well-known specialist in Russian events and in Russian current history. And after the glass of cognac, Stalin told him, it was the most dangerous moment in my life. Collectivization was most dangerous moment in my life. Not this war. And it was August 42, so before Stalingrad. Not this war, not civil war, but collectivization. During collectivization, we may lost our power at all. It's interesting enough that in his memoirs, in his book about Second World War, Churchill wrote very carefully this talk with Stalin, and these his words. But when this book was published in Russian by special libraries during the communist time, this fragment was over. But in English edition it is. But now we have a Russian document, because a Russian KGB, of course, also noted all these conversation. They seated in the next room and noted everything. Of course, not in these words, more moderate, but the words of Stalin are the same. It was the most terrible moment in his life. Collectivization in itself means one very serious thing. The traditional social structure of Russia was liquidated forever. Predominantly peasant state turned to be the state of slaves. And in some sense, dear friends, we ought to understand that the inner sense of this collectivization. You maybe remember that in the first lecture I told you that Peter the Great wanted to have Russia one of the predominant states of Europe. Before this, his brother and sister, Sofia and Fyodor Alexeyevich, previous rulers of Russia, they wanted to organize step by step, slow modernization of Russia, following some Polish methods. But Peter the Great wanted to see immediately Russia one of the strongest states of the Europe. That's why he needed money for fleet, for army, and that's why he enslaved the majority of population of Russia, turned them to serfs without any rights, and he realized his dream at that time. Russia won the North War, turned to be empire in 1721, but the result was revolution. And, in the 20th century, the situation was maybe absolutely the same. Stalin wanted to turn Russia from slowly developing a peasant country, which it was during the time of new economic politics, to military superpower. A military superpower which will be able to conquer the world, or maybe Europe, maybe half of Europe. At that time, in Italy was fascist regime. In this time, Nazi wanted to take power, and Stalin also understood very well that it is a time to prepare Russia for a new great war in Europe. But with peasants, with their plots of land, with their cows and horses, it was impossible to collect enough money to organize the strongest army. And he decided, it was of course a very stupid solution, but he decided that he turned Russian population to slaves again, to concentrate power in his hands, and to take money from these people for a new military industry. He did so, but the price of this collectivization was terrible. The level of agriculture was dropped in 2 times. So, after collectivization, only about 60% of grain, which was before collectivization, was produced by agriculture, and about 45% of meat was produced by cattle, by the amount of cattle, amount of cows and horses dropped more than twice at that time. And of course, human victims. I even wrote the special figure to tell you that 152 million of cattle died during collectivization. 125 million of heads of cattle, of cows, horses, and other cattle. And about 9 million people died during collectivization. So it was a terrible loss, a terrible deed. And Stalin did not succeed at all. He, of course, he could, with the help of Western world, and Western world at that time, just as now, was ready to help Russia, communist Russia, not seeing on the terrible deeds which communists done in Russia. And many plants were erected at that time, and tanks and planes started to produce. But we'll see in the nearest future that with no positive effect, because after this terrible massacre of population in the beginning of 30s, Stalin decided to, and of course the struggle with religion, the enforced atheism, was one of the main roots of communist ideology, of communist politics, because person who has religious ideas is independent from him. In some way, it's necessary to have money to be independent, but in some way, dear friends, it's necessary to have religious ideas. Some belief in something which is stronger than rulers of this world. When you believe in God, you're free from prince. That's why communists struggle with religion, not because of some theoretical ideas, but because of these principles. Their totalitarian idea asks them to possess all the human being, not only his body, but also his soul. That's why, and only if person is totally in the hands of these communist leaders, this person is possible to be used as soldier, as source for building worldwide communist empire. And that's why it was struggle against religion also. And after collectivization, Stalin accepted new constitution in the December 1936. new constitution of Russia was proclaimed. You know very well, dear friends, that in the end of 18th and in the beginning of the 19th century, the idea of constitution was one of the most modern ideas in the world. The first constitution was maybe of new type was French constitution, then Polish constitution, then in some months Constitution of the United States. And the idea of constitution was very modern, very of mode. But in the beginning of the 20th century, all countries had their constitutions. And the new constitution of the communist state, of Soviet communist state, was one interesting feature. They allow everything, just as in the United States. But it was not impossible to realize anything from this everything. They give freedom of speech, freedom of faith, freedom of economic activity, but nothing of this can be realized. This constitution was accepted by all country referendum, but the result of this referendum was absolutely, of course, falsified. They were falsified. But after this, so constitution was taken and proclaimed in December 1936. And Stalin immediately, after this, said that it is necessary to organize a new census in Russia, to know how many people live in Russia, what they think and what they do. And among these questions for this census, which was organized on Orthodox Julian Christmas on the 7th of January 1937. There was one question which was written into this questionnaire by Stalin himself. This question was attitude to religion. Never before, during the communist period, in this census, this question occurred. Nobody asked about it. Stalin was sure that religion is finished in Russia. Struggle against religion was about 2 decades. Almost all monasteries, almost all churches were closed. Priests were priests, and also mosques were closed, and synagogues, and these religious leaders were persecuted. And he was sure that it is the end, it's the finish of religion, that the population of Russia, which he named Soviet Union, totally in his hands. Without religion, without land, without property, all the population of Russia turned to be mass of people. So only some physical amount, nothing else. The first very interesting, and he asked in this questionnaire that only people who are elder than 15 may answer this question about their attitude to religion. And it is not traditional attitude. So I born in Muslim family. It was your personal attitude. You ought to say if you are a believer or not. And if you're a believer, what confession you follow. Of course, this questionnaire was not anonymous. Everybody write his name, first name, patronymic name, place of life, place of residence. So it was in some way open proclamation of the attitude to religion of each person. And after 2 decades of struggle against religion, with a lot of martyrs, with a lot of victims. First result of this census was that the population of Russia was 15 million lower than it was supposed to be. In our statistics department, people suppose that in the Soviet Union lived 150 million people, but it turned to be 162 million people, so 18 millions less. It was the result of collectivization, of course, and other terrible massacres of population and civil war. The second item was that 56.07% of population elder than 15 declared themselves believers, and only 43.3% declared non-believers. So, and of course, majority of believers are Orthodox Christians, though about 12% are Muslim, Jews, and other, and followers of other religions. So the majority of people of Russia at that terrible year, 1937, after the 2 decades of communism, expressed openly their faith. We don't know how many prefer not to express, how many gave fails answer, but almost 57%, and in millions, it is 55.3 million people. They prefer to declare their faith in atheistic, totalitarian, terroristic state. I think that it is some unprecedented expression of nonconformism in the world and in the 20th century. After this, Stalin and his colleagues in Politburo, they decided to make these results secret and even to destroy all these lists and to kill the sociologists who did this census. Only after the end of the communist epoch, in archives, we succeed to find some parts of this census. And now we have some books where all the results which we could find, we publish. This census, now named in Russian history as «Расстрелянная перепись», shoot up census. But the result of this census was very, very great. On the 20th of May, 1937, Malenkov, one of the members of Politburo, and in future he will be some years ruler of Russia, between the death of Stalin and the reign of Khrushchev, Malenkov wrote a special letter to Stalin in which he said that with this population, it's impossible to liberate the world from bourgeoisie. In normal words, it's impossible to conquer the world. we ought to clean the Soviet Union from all these dissidents, from all these non-conformists. And on the end of May, on the 26th of May, it was a decision of Politburo that this question ought to be discussed. And on the 2nd of July, 1937, the decision to start great massacre of population, to clean population of all believers, of all non-conformist, anti-communist, as they named, elements, was signed, and the decree number 00447 was published on the secret, of course, decree on the 30th of July 1937, and this decree was the decree to start Great Terror. The result of this Great Terror was official figures, only official figures. 1.5, maybe 1,575,000 people were arrested, and among them 681,000 persons were killed in 1 year and 3 months, in 15 months. I am sure that the real figures are higher, much higher. I spoke with very interesting man, great supporter of Gorbachev, Alexander Nikolaevich Yakovlev, who worked in archives. He was a member of Politburo during Perestroika and worked in archives personally. He wrote the thick book, Dark Times, about his memoirs. And I spoke with him. He is sure that real figures are much higher. But it's interesting that these repressions, while starting, also immediately penetrated not to simple population, not to believers, but also to high-level communist officials, even members of Politburo, and some persons who signed this document of Great Terror were the victims of this terror in the nearest 15 months. Among them, 2 heads of KGB, at that time NKVD. It's Yegoda and Yezhov. Both of them were killed, one by one. One killed another, and then Beria killed Yezhov, the second one. So it was massacre in the communist elite also, and not only in the communist elite. In the military elite, among generals and officers of the Soviet army. It was something unbelievable. But Stalin, preparing the war with the Europe, ordered to kill them 50% of his generals and admirals, because he afraid them taking power from him. So the possession of power was the main idea of communist elite. Even the possibility to fight for worldwide state is lower than the idea of preservation of power. All of you ought to understand it. Not some national ideas, not some socialist ideas, not some sophisticated philosophical Marxist, Hegelianist ideas, but simple zeal for power. was the main and the only motive of communist elite. Or everything else is only propaganda. And as it always happened, the checking of this state is war, just as now, when we see war between Russia and Ukraine. War immediately eliminate propaganda and show the real picture. And the real picture of the war, which started, terrible war, which started in 1939 with the war in Finland, opened the very simple thing. Communist state and communist army are very thick. It failed to struggle even against Finnish army successfully. And so all this terrible monster was built with no real base. It was only fear, massacre, and nothing else. And this zeal for power produced not strong, but very thick state. And the results of this new situation we'll try to continue to discuss on the next lecture. Dear friends.
So your questions, comments, remarks, objections,
ideas, reflections, whatever you like.
Good evening. I have a curious question. The events you were talking about today, I wanted to ask if and how are they being taught in Russian schools?
In Russian schools, what about this?
If the events you talked about today.
I want to tell you frankly that in Russian schools, school teachers continue to teach in previous communist paradigm, with maybe some very short reflex that there were some repressions, there were some murders among communist elites, there was struggle, but as in Hegel philosophy, all what existed was absolutely significant. So if it was collectivization, it was necessary to have collectivization. If it was repressions, it was necessary to have repressions, maybe not so wide repressions, but it was necessary because of enemies, etc., etc. In the beginning of 19th, we had different approach to school teaching of history. And I also work in this. But now, under the Putin's regime, we return to communist paradigm in this sense. So what I tell you is not the thing which is taught in Russian schools. And it is not a history in itself, as you understand. I only try to give you some idea of history of this period.
The most horrifying part of your lecture isn't that it happened, but it is because it's happening right now in China. We can see it with a very clear distinction that the exact events that happened are replaying right now as we speak in China. And I won't delve into it because we would be here for hours and hours. I wanted to ask a very different question, and that is your opinion upon Beria. Because he was a very horrible person, but when I looked into him a little bit, I found a very curious thing, that he was the only leader who actually supported democratization efforts.
Yes.
Or
Yes, it's a good question, but maybe it's unpleasant for you, but I ask you to go to the next lecture, where I open this secret for you and for all other people who decide to visit this lecture. Because the case of Beria is really an interesting case, really, and it is necessary to be understood. So if I, by chance, I'm an old person, if I forget about this, you will remind me. But next lecture.
You have talked about the realistic view of the part what we have talked about, but I want to ask you about the idealistic people who believed, some leaders of Soviet Russia, and what happened about them. There was some disillusions or think what they think about what happened and why that happened. Also, in many West countries, in that time there was some popularity of communism in France, in Germany, and also in Czech. So I want to ask you about that, because also in the United States there was some reporters in that time that write about the great state of Soviet Russia and the great reformers. So that's my question.
You know that Lenin himself names these people useful idiots. Yeah, because they really believe in these things, but not communist leaders of Russia. Because if communist leaders of Russia believe in these idealistical principles, they made suicide when they saw what they did. But nobody of them did so, except maybe Masarykovy. Nobody. Because they understood very well, and there are a lot of their letters and articles, and I read a lot of them. Their attitude toward ruling the state was totally pragmatic. No idealism at all among them. The idea of pragmatism, as I have already told you, was a possession of power, nothing else. If workers are against it, it ought to be crushed, as in St. Petersburg and Kronstadt uprising. If peasants against it, they ought to be crushed, as in these revolts on Volga region, you remember, in Western Siberia, etc. So the only idea is power. And now we have some archives, secret archives, open and are published. In major word with the help of this Alexander Nikolaevich Yakovlev. And these secret documents show us that there were no idealism at all. In their secret discussions in Politburo with KGB at that time, AGPU leaders, they spoke absolutely openly, with no communist phrase at all, to control over a Russian population, by all means. By all means. And all means mean one mean. It is terror. Yes.
What do you think about the book of Nikolai Berdyaev, Beginnings and...
of Russian communism?
Yes.
It's a very good book, but since he himself was an idealistic person and lived in the world of ideas, these ideas also, he supposed that communists also has some ideas, though wrong, and tried to explain these their mistakes in ideological sense. But now, when we know more Berdyaev because of archives, we see that there were no idealism at all. People for example, idealists, for example, Pyotr Kropotkin, a well-known anarchist. He lived in a small town of Dmitrov near Moscow and died of starvation and of illness because of starvation as I remember, in 1919. So nobody gives him money, gives him nothing. He was an idealist, revolutionary prince and idealist. But this man ate black caviar and were absolutely pragmatic persons. Absolutely. Drink good wines, drove good cars confiscated, live in palaces. You know that Lenin lived in the palace of Moscow general governor in Gorky. And go hunting and feel themselves very well. I think that...
Next.
Goodbye. Hope to wish you...
My question is, do you think anything would have been different if Leon Trotsky replaced Lenin? Or do you think it would have been the same as with Stalin?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I lost your question. What is it?
Do you think anything would have been different if Leon Trotsky replaced Lenin?
No, I think that nothing different occurred. The ideas, even Trotsky, when he ought to leave Russia, he was expelled from Russia, as you remember, by Stalin in 1927. And he later wrote that Stalin used his ideas when he finished this new economic politics and started collectivization. It was ideas of Trotsky. So I think that if Trotsky would be leader of Russia, we'll see absolutely the same situation. Maybe difference will be in some details, but not very serious. And the level of totalitarian state was the same. I think that,
The last question.
The last one.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you what Russia people think about Lavrentine Beria.
Lavrentine Beria. Again, the same question. From the first road and from the last road. I suppose you have some complot against me for Beria, because you see all the whole under your supervision. I'll tell you about Beria. Many people now in Russia speak positively about Stalin, and many people speak positively about Beria, but the reason is the only one. Not because Beria was a very good person, but Russian people are very bad educated people. So thank you very much, dear friends.
Thank you.